So to my immediate right is Mathieu Mazerolle. He's Senior Product Manager for Athera at Foundry. And the reason why he is here is because when I saw their product and what it does, I was amazed. Because it uses cloud computing so that everybody could be a Marvel studio. I'm good promotion for you.
That's pretty good.
Yeah,
I like it.
So please, let's give Mathieu a big round of applause.
Hi, everyone. I'm Matt. So I'm just going to start off by saying this is actually a couple of things. First, it's a story from the content creation side. I've been really impressed hearing all these great stories about how client to cloud, 5G, all this stuff is transforming the distribution side. My world's a little bit different, where we focus on providing tools to creators. And I want to talk a little bit about how cloud is disrupting the content creation side and some of the dynamics going on there. Another thing as well is this is the story about the world, sort of the learnings from Athera. We actually closed Athera down last week, probably not quick enough to update Neil, but it's actually been a really kind of an interesting adventure, and there's a lot of learnings we got from that, and we have some pretty well-informed predictions about where cloud is going for content creation, especially for visual effects and film in general, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit. Probably, a lot of those are crazy theories, but I think there's something to them. I'll talk a little bit just about myself, who I am, a little bit like the panel here. I'm just a game developer who did a bunch of stuff and turned to the dark side. I've worked on content creation tools. I've shipped video games. This is a studio I started in my mid-20s as an entrepreneur. I led the development of Assassin's Creed, but I've also worked on a lot of tools and engines, and essentially just about everything in my career has been about building tools and bringing technology to the people who create content. So as much as I'm a gamer and I like seeing, everything from the latest Netflix thing to the latest blockbuster, my direct customers are artists, and they're creative people. And by and large, they're people who see technology as a means to an end to enable their creativity, as opposed to the way I see it, which is, really cool stuff. So I'll get into a little bit. So I'm with Foundry. We're a company that provides a whole variety of tools to creatives, from 3D tools to storyboarding tools. We've got a really cool tool that just does lighting, but we also serve the design industry. We've got this neat tool called Colorway, which colorways are basically ways of changing colors and patterns on things like apparel, for example, or anything that you might design in the real world. So design is becoming like a big part of our business. Our biggest product is called Nuke. Nuke is basically Photoshop for movies. So it's very close to the kind of the final end of the pipeline, where you're bringing all the images together, all the layers, the explosion, the robot, Vancouver that you made look like New York, and all the teeth are whitened, and that all goes through Nuke. Just about any Hollywood movie you've seen probably went through Nuke. So that's what we do. Let me tell you a little bit about the history of Athera, because for me, Athera is the sort of the context around which I'm going to build my crazy theories for where cloud is going for content creators in the future. So, and by the way, I promise, if Bebo's still here, I promise, I'm not sure if he is, there's a little bit of a nod to theories about what might happen there with blockchain, actually. So about 5 years ago, Foundry, one of Foundry's closest customers, Industrial Light and Magic, the Star Wars guys, they were really looking at how cloud was going to be, would potentially disrupt the way that they make movies. And this was, given where we are in the industry right now, like That's actually like a long time ago. Like this is really, really kind of almost prophetic that they were kind of wondering like, wow, what's actually going to happen? Because we were pretty close with them, we teamed up and we said, well, how about we just do a research project together? And we went off and got some funding, and we created this thing called Forge. And Forge was just the idea of what would happen if you took the existing content creation pipeline, just tore it all into pieces and reassembled it from the ground up with all the cloud things dialed to 11. And a whole bunch of cool ideas came out of that, like ideas like all the files should be in the cloud, all the storage is in the cloud. The pipeline and all the tools and everything should be in containers and should work just like immutable infrastructure. The idea of licensing and entitlements is a spawn of evil and should be removed because everything should be completely elastic. The idea that you shouldn't have a render farm and queues for jobs, for people waiting to see their movies getting rendered out. There should be infinite pools of compute that people can tap into whenever they need. So we built Forge. Forge turned into Athera. This is just kind of the marketing video we have for Athera, but what Athera really was, and I can still show you a demo today if you like to come by and actually see it in action, because we've still kind of got it running in the background. The idea behind Athera is that any of us in this room, if we've got a laptop and an internet connection, we could be anywhere in the world and we could start a studio and we could be Marvel for a minute. So we could hook up cloud storage or upload our files into cloud storage, and we could set up a project with permissions and roles, and then we could spin up what we call sessions, which are basically like encapsulated environments where there's a, almost like Google Sheets, where there'd be the piece of software and it would immediately have access to the files no matter where you were from the world. And you could access that workstation or that environment from a web browser or a thin client. And when you stopped using it, you would stop paying for it. And if you need to render, you'd be able to spin up hundreds or thousands of render nodes to access all that data and compute it into a final image form. And what was neat is nothing needed to move around. Like the last speaker here said, like one of the cool things is, once you've sort of released your bits into the cloud, they sort of stay there. And the really great thing about doing that as a creative is once you've done that, all that data is accessible to huge amounts of compute without needing to move around or wait or be managed. And that's kind of what Athera proposed. But there's just one problem. Athera was way ahead of its time. We had some really cool pioneering projects, but kind of where I'm getting at this presentation is, there's, I think the next 3 big leaps that the content creation industry is going to take in cloud, probably Athera is the next leap after the one coming up. And then I think there's another one coming after that, and another one after that that I think are within range to be kind of defined or predicted. So I'll talk about that a little bit. But first, I want to talk about maybe why it was so hard to build something as disruptive as a pure cloud creative environment, and kind of what the industry is really moving to next. And some of that has to do with the market forces. So why is the content creation industry even caring about cloud right now? It actually has nothing to do with technology. It doesn't have anything to do with what people read in Business Week about cloud and how everyone has to do it. It has to do with a lot of pressures having to do with the market and how consumers are wanting more and more and more. They want more explosions. They want more Netflix shows. And the studios have had to grow larger and larger. But they're approaching the limits of vertical integration. Like right now, the largest studios, our largest customers, have gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And they're at the point where literally when I go talk to them, they have run out of physical space. Like they can't fit people in the buildings. They're shipping data to India, for example, just in order to have overflow. But this creates all sorts of problems because now their infrastructure is sort of spread all over the place. So they're reaching kind of limits of vertical integration. There's locality of talent. It's really hard to find people. Even if you had all of these artists, you were able to find them, they're all over the place, right? They're not all in London, Vancouver, or Montreal, which are the major centers for visual effects. there's just rapid growth. There's more and more work. It's not just Marvel movies that are getting bigger and bigger, but now there's Netflix. Now, there's commercials. Now there's all sorts of web content. And all of this stuff demands super, super high-end creative tools and super, super high-end talent to use it. And all of that work is causing a huge amount of growth. I mentioned tax incentives. So it's the largest areas in the world where visual effects production is done, movie production, game production as well. And by the way, if you're from the game industry, you're probably seeing, you're probably nodding your head seeing a lot of this stuff too. There's just only so many people you can put in Vancouver and Montreal. And startup CapEx, right? So the solution to this would be like, hey, let's all just make a bunch of small companies. And that's actually what's happening. A lot of people are going freelance. A lot of people are, a lot of these companies at the limits of vertical integration are subcontracting. They're going to freelancers. And now everything's being done in this kind of almost tribal sort of way. But these small startups, they need to start up, and they need to buy computers, and they need to buy render blades, and they need to buy licenses, and they might have a 6 to 12 month lifespan, or they might not have another project lined up after the first one they win, right? So that big hump of starting up is really, really tough, right? Someone mentioned that having to do with graphics cards, right? It's very similar to a startup. But there's people pressures too. And having developed Athera with a small number of really, really intimate customers, a lot of them were futurists and pioneers, the pain they were feeling that brought them to the cloud, the personal pain points, the ones that affected them as an individual, as an artist, as a creator, were the ones that actually got me out of bed every day. That's the stuff I show, my CEO. But the stuff that motivated me was people who were looking for work-life balance. It's huge, right? When I launched Athera, I had an artist named Hugo Guerra who does a lot of freelance work. And he had a slide where it was a picture of a crowded London tube. And he's like, I have to take this, used to have to take this every day, 2 hours each way to go to a studio in Soho. And it just I couldn't see my wife. It was really, really painful to him. So he cared more about finding good work life. I had one creator on my platform who moved from Vancouver to Halifax across the whole country because he wanted work-life balance. Even though that put at risk his ability to find work by moving away from Vancouver, he's like, the cloud will allow me to work in Halifax, right? Big deal. So the rise of freelancing. I mentioned this thing, people want to go freelance. They want to work for themselves. They want to see the result of their work in a tangible way as opposed to having, done that 3 frames of that one shot on that giant movie. People are tired of migrating for work. The tax incentives and a lot of the way these large studios are structured mean people have to move from project to project. So that's very challenging for people, especially if they have families. Creative kinship. This is an interesting one too. There's people that just vibe together, I might want to work with this guy who's just really, really great at doing destruction simulations, and we work together on this one movie, and I'm really good at, for example, doing compositing work, but we know that we work really well together and we have a great creative language, but we don't live in the same city. Or we work together on that one project, but then we broke apart. The cloud can bring them together again, allow people from different places to work together. And just the whole idea of putting art before technology, right? If you don't have to worry about all of the computer setup and how to wire them together and get the licenses and all of that kind of IT overhead that huge studios have entire departments for, it becomes very liberating. And to be perfectly clear, we're not there yet with cloud, right? If you go to AWS or you go to Google or you go to Azure and you're an artist, trust me, their websites are not going to talk to you, right? They're not going to speak your language. Their SDKs are all stuff for developers. But there's going to be a day where we're going to have services and things layered over this stuff, and maybe even from these providers where it'll actually talk to an artist. They'll be able to go in and get a tool that allows them to create as opposed to a thing for a developer to program. So everybody likes the Gartner adoption curve, so I threw one in. I think for me, content distribution, as far as where we are with cloud, we're getting there, right? If it wasn't for Netflix, when I was at autoscaling, Netflix was the 500-pound gorilla, right? Nobody autoscaled more than Netflix because people came home, watched tons of shows, and you could see the patterns. I I could see the patterns in people using my service, and it matched people's daily life, right? Now, they were so far ahead of the curve. Like, media distribution has adopted cloud. Everyone is it's like Netflix was like Tesla, right? And what we're seeing with cloud for content distribution, I think is like, you know, what the car industry will be in like 5 to 10 years when everyone's doing it and everyone's chasing, you know, chasing the leader that kind of hit that plateau first. But oddly, we're not there with content creation. We're in this like, we're getting close to the peak of inflation. I think we're actually building ourselves up in a lather over getting to the peak of inflated expectations, but we're going for it, but we're behind. We're way behind the curve. So why is that, right? So what's holding content creators back from going full force on cloud, trying to find the future? So there's the usual ones, right? And I have this conversation with everyone I talk to about cloud, right? Every single person says 3 things: security, cost, performance, boom, 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 every time, right? Talk to me about security. Cloud's not secure. I don't believe it's secure. People steal stuff in the cloud, the Instagram hacks, all this stuff. Cost, cloud's expensive, right? It's really, performance, there's no way that I can get, you know, my 8K footage over a wire, you know, it has to be under the desktop. Now, there's objections to all of these things, right? Like, in a lot of ways, cloud security is better than on-prem security, right? Cost, it's because you have to think differently about costs, right? So you're thinking about costs as a function of usage as opposed to a function of depreciation of CapEx. And performance, like, we're getting there. Like, we had the 5G conversation, which is great around wireless, but just in general, like, the gentleman's compression talk today, right? Like, I love that stuff. There's ways of getting around the performance issues, and it's getting better and better and better. But the ones that people don't like to talk to me about in meetings are the ones that I sense, is there's a lack of expertise, right? If I walk into a studio and I talk to their very, very, very top IT people, chances are these are people who understand how to install GPUs, how to install like local wiring really well, whatever. If I talk to their top like technical experts, like their CTO, like these are people who've been to their 25th SIGGRAPH, understand computer graphics. But if I try to, you know, if I mention like a Docker container, or I mention, mention like how big is your ops team? Do you know how to do deployments? Like that's a mess, complete mess. There's a lack of expertise because people are not picking up this new set of technologies nearly as rapidly as they have been able to pick up the ones that were necessary for them in the old days, which was computer graphics. In fact, that's what they should concentrate on. They shouldn't have to go and worry about all this stuff in the long run. But we're kind of at this uncomfortable period where for the industry to get its head around cloud, they have to kind of roll their sleeves up and get this cloud expertise, at least in the short term, because there's nothing turnkey out there right now. And establish pipelines, right? Everything's got momentum. So the way we did things on the last project is probably the way we should do things on the next project, except for this and this and this. And the only time you get a chance to change anything is either if you start a new studio, like I said, which is really hard, or by finding a little bit of time between shows, right? And trust me, there's no studio I've ever seen who has had enough time between shows to completely disrupt their business and move to cloud. I've seen a few do it over a period of time, and some of them are getting really, really good at it. I've talked to some companies in New York, and one of them gave a speech at SIGGRAPH that I hosted, which was really cool, where this guy completely transformed his company and started to move to cloud. But it's not the norm yet. So those are kind of the reasons around why there's an issue. But if we were to put all of that aside, and we were to say, look, there's tons of time between shows, and we've got cloud expertise in our blood now, and we've reasoned about security, cost, performance. I'm going to get a little bit more kind of into the technical side. Like, the biggest problem with moving to cloud is the gravity well. I'm going to talk about the gravity well. This is not my line. You can use it if you like. I'll try to give credit back to the person who said it to me. But this came up in a meeting when someone was talking about Athera, and we're talking about how to get your data in and out. And I was trying to explain, like, getting your data in and out is actually kind of not a good idea. You kind of want to put your data in and keep it there. And I was like, yeah, I was at this talk, we were talking about cloud tech, and the whole problem is how do you get the tools, the pipeline, the renderers, the remote freelancer on the other side of the country, like how do you get, and the director on set, how do you get them all to talk to the data? Because the data is the gravity well. And this is so true. If you're thinking about cloud and content creation, the gravity well of your data is where you have to start building everything around, right? And today that's really tricky. So how did that kind of gravity well sort of move? So this is like old school. Like if you were doing cloud in 2005 and creating content, you probably had a buddy and you were sharing a Dropbox, right? And a lot of people still do that today, by the way. And don't tell the MPAA or the security people that there's tons of shows being produced with shared Dropboxes, but it's true. There's a revolution around 2010 where people said, we finally got cloud figured out, we're going to go to cloud rendering. And these great services like Zinc came out on Google, Conductor, AWS has got a service called Deadline, which is pretty cool. And cloud rendering was really neat because it gave you more CPUs than you could have in your walls, right? And it was talked up a lot, but nobody really talked about the fact that it really messed your gravity well up, right? So if I've got this really, really huge amount of data that I've got a bunch of artists working on, and I want to take advantage of this cloud rendering service, I somehow have to move, maybe not the whole data, but at least the data that's relevant for that job into the cloud so I could have these, this infinite, this magical land of millions and millions of CPUs, and everything's good, and then I have to pull it all back, right? So everything's round tripping, I'm throwing data over the wall, I've got another gravity well. I have to first figure out sending the right data, because guess what, my scenes, my referencing, all that stuff is like, the tools are not helping me there, right? There's files laying around all over the place, I've got environment variables and plugins and licenses and a bunch of stuff that wants to phone home. Throwing that over the fence in the cloud is not easy. Once it's in the cloud, it's eating up storage space. So now I've got my files in 2 places. So it's more cost, and it's more things to manage, and it's also security-wise potentially a larger security footprint. And then I have to pull it all back, right? And now I have to worry, the right version, I have to manage all that, and I have to wait. Great for getting CPUs, not so great for, being seamless. We've evolved now to like a lot of studios playing with virtual workstations. And virtual workstations are great because they're really great for managing that CapEx side. And they can also get you a little bit closer to having like one gravity well off-prem. But generally, a lot of people are spinning up virtual workstations, but still want them connected to their on-prem storage for a variety of reasons. So virtual workstations are kind of like the next little baby step in the movement to cloud. And the next thing coming up right now, which I think is going to be what we're going to see in the next couple of years, is kind of unmanaged infrastructure as a service. So this is going to be not just virtualize all the things, but like integrate all of them. And this is where I think, Athera was like one step just ahead of this, where it was a managed infrastructure as a service. But talking to one of my friends at Google recently, mainly because we ran Athera on Google Cloud, not that we have anything against AWS, but my buddy at Google is like, yeah, unmanaged infrastructure as a service is where everything's going for the big studios. They all want to take basic cloud infrastructure and sort of start trying to plug it into their stuff and orchestrate it themselves. But the real revolution for me is going to come in the next couple of steps. Fully managed infrastructure as a service is going to be a big game changer. And what that means is now I'm not going to need to have my stuff on premise. I don't need to worry about an EC2 instance or cloud storage tiers or regions or licenses or even what the collection of things that have to work together and the environment settings and all that have to be between different artists so they remain consistent, right? All the stuff is going to be in a box, and it's going to be transportable from place to place in an immutable fashion, and I'll be able to turn it on, turn it off, and only pay for what I use. And then I think we're going to move to an even further step, which is creative tools as a service, right? So now everything we're talking about now is sort of taking the old way of doing things, but moving them all in the cloud and having some really clever layers orchestrate the stuff. But imagine you actually get down to the applications themselves and you just deconstruct them, right? We work today, our creative tools are built around these, and by the way, this goes for game engines too, right? It's not just tools for visual effects in Hollywood, but there are these monolithic things, right? Where I've got this big user interface with a gazillion options, and I have to go to a really complicated school, learn a bunch of stuff, and use this tool. But imagine, and then there's a director on set who's got a different tool, and there's an artist doing a different type of, content creation, maybe destruction, painting, storyboarding. Well, imagine all these tools were actually just microservices living in the cloud that could be assembled and rebuilt according to different people's needs, right? So I'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail, just real quick. So managed infrastructure as a service. So what is it, unmanaged infrastructure as a service. What does it take to move to that next step? So this step here, right? So what's it going to take to move there? Well, it's going to take a couple of things, right? There needs to be improvements to data locality, licensing, and pipeline mobility. So data locality is, first of all, if I'm moving to virtualize all the things, all of the stuff that's going to be virtualized needs to really understand where the data is, and it needs to be able to reference data in a way that doesn't assume it's living on a local hard disk, right? Whether that's a local hard disk on a virtual machine or on a desktop or whatever, all the applications that we have today need to understand that things are not files, right? So multi-tier storage is a big one. Athera had a really sophisticated multi-tier storage system where everything was in slow cloud storage, but the minute you accessed it, it went into the super high-speed cache available to all of your collaborators, and then it would get evicted after time. So the idea of like managing like what's hot, what's not, where your data is, should be something that just has a lot of brains, and assets are not files, right? So when I fire up an application or I say I'm going to work on shot 5 of episode 3, the whole thing knows how to orchestrate not just getting my application, my environment, but also all the files I need and sync with everyone else. Licensing is another one. If I'm going to be able to move work between places and files between places, licensing is just going to become a huge problem, right? So today we've got a world where people have to stand up local license servers and they have to phone home, all this complicated stuff. Moving to cloud licensing and moving to usage-based licensing models is going to be a big revolution. By the way, Foundry is working on all this stuff, and we're pretty bold about it. And I think a lot of people are already doing this stuff. And I think everyone's going to move here. One of the big problems we found with licensing actually is plugin vendors, little guys, where there's got like some guy who's got a really, really amazing plugin that does like denoising or some amazing image processing algorithm that's like way ahead. But then they got to sell this thing, so they stick this really crappy 1980s licensing system on top of it, right? So imagine they had something better. It would be really great, and it would move us forward. Pipeline mobility is a big thing, right? So how do I take my pipeline that I want to deploy to a freelancer and just give them what they need and make sure it works consistently with the rest of the studio? Environment variables, OSs, Python versions, all that stuff, right? So in the old days, you would just sort of have someone manage it, and now people have moved to imaging machines, and now they've moved to virtual machines. But I actually think containers are going to bring a lot of innovation there because containers can be versioned, they're immutable, they're easy to deploy, and you can multi-tenant. It's a really great technology. Once we figure out containers, it can be really easy to capture and move pipelines and make them deployable anywhere. The next step after that is obviously managed infrastructure as a service. So I mentioned Athera, so I still think Athera is the next thing after everyone's kind of figured out how to start cloudifying things. But Athera, obviously, like I said, we've kind of put it on hiatus. Some people are working on stuff in this area, but I think there's going to be a gold rush towards building managed services for creatives in the next 5 years. But that means providing all the applications, providing all the storage, providing access to virtual environments, and all of the rendering and compute power that goes behind it as a fully managed thing. So that's pretty easy to see kind of what happens next. So I think within the next phase, and this is going to take a lot of boldness from the folks who are building tools, and it's going to be a really disruptive way of looking at not just our business models, but looking at how we deliver and service applications or tools for people, is this idea of applications as a service. So if you've got all of your data shared in a place that's controlled, it's auditable, it's encrypted, it's multi-tier, it's elastic, it becomes really easy to imagine people end up building services. Vendors can build services that can take this data, transform it, write it back, share it, and then the idea of what exactly is an application just becomes views on that, right? So I might have an artist in a studio using a couple of services from vendors A and B, and I might have a freelancer using, the same services, and I might have a director on set using another subset of services, right? And they should all see the same thing. You should be able to orchestrate these services and just put skins on them, right? And those skins are not the applications, they're just sort of the views on services, and we might call that an application, but they're really just tools. And tools just become ways of looking at orchestrated services. I think there's actually something even beyond this. So when we were working on Athera, this, by the way, is a plan of record for Athera 2.0. So once we get there, we've kind of got a plan in our back pocket for that. But I think this is going to be something really neat that people will start working on soon, and will start hitting the industry in probably like 5 to 10 years. Going longer term, I mean, we've talked about cloud for content creation, yeah. And there's some even bigger picture stuff. Asset classification is one. People creating content want to be able to find their content, find that tree, or give me all the stuff that was on the giant robot in episode 1, because we're going to do it in episode 6. Removal of drudgery is a big one, right? This is where machine learning models become really cool. So things like rotoscoping and that type of stuff can be machine assisted, right? And remove a lot of drudge work. There's a lot of drudge work in the industry. It can be removed. Cost prediction is a big one, right? This is one of the big things where, like, how do you overcome the fear of elastic costs? Well, one of the ways you overcome them is by having predictive models. And if you can look at the dimensions of someone's workload and kind of predict what the cost of another workload that's not the same but shares similarities, that's really comforting, right? And then you can have confidence levels and stuff like that. Digital contracting, okay, this, by the way, this is my blockchain one. All these freelancers are all working and they all want to get paid, and they have a hard time getting paid, right? How do you even find them? How do you, Bebo said, like, how do you get two people who don't even like each other to enter into a contract, right? Trust me, in visual effects, that happens all the time. People don't like each other. So that's a big deal. And I think assisted creativity is another one. We're going to have computers and machines that are powered by the cloud telling us what edit works better than others, or what version of the dialogue worked better than others, or maybe even suggest some, right? And that's going to be really crazy, but I think it's actually going to come. And that's all I have. I hope you enjoyed it. And like I said, if you guys want to know more, you can talk to me later.